Today we will be discussing about the ovulation and the menstrual cycle. So this highly illustrated diagram is taken from the Nature Science illustrative notes, and this will be very helpful for you to understand the ovulation and the menstrual cycle. So basically, before going on to the ovulation, we should understand द टू इम्पॉर्टेंट हॉर्मोन्स जो कि ओव्यूलेशन में जो है बहुत ही इम्पॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले करने वाले हैं. सो दैट आर FSH एंड LH. So what happens is that this portion you can see is your hypothalamus. And below this portion, this is the region which leads to the infundibulum and ultimately leads to the pituitary gland. This portion is your anterior pituitary, also known as your adenohypophysis. Now होता क्या है कि कुछ न्यूक्लियस, स्पेशलाइज्ड न्यूक्लियस, सो सपोज दिस इज योर pre-optic nucleus and this is your arcuate nucleus. What they're gonna do is that they both will produce a hormone which is GnRH, that is gonadotropin releasing hormone. एंड ये गोनाडोट्रोपिन रिलीजिंग हार्मोन क्या होगा, इस इनफंडिबुलम के अंदर जो है एक हाइपोफाइजियल पोर्टल सर्कुलेटरी सिस्टम मौजूद है जो कि इस हार्मोन को ट्रांसपोर्ट करने में हेल्प करेगा फ्रॉम हाइपोथैलेमस टू द एंटीरियर पिट्यूटरी. एंड ये क्या करेगा, पॉजिटिव सिग्नल्स इंड्यूस करेगा ताकि गोनाडोट्रॉप्स जो है वो प्रोड्यूस हो सके. और दो तरीके के गोनाडोट्रॉप्स जो है वो प्रोड्यूस होते हैं एंड दैट्स योर FSH and your LH. Now these are produced from your anterior pituitary. This is your posterior pituitary. Again, this is your hypothalamus. This is your master gland which is controlling the anterior pituitary and your posterior pituitary, and the hormone is transported through the hypophyseal portal circulatory system. Now this GnRH which is produced by these two specialized nucleus is get transported and creating the positive signals towards the anterior pituitary and producing gonadotrophs. Now these are LH and FSH. FSH is known as your follicle stimulating hormone and LH को हम कहते हैं ल्यूटिनाइजिंग हार्मोन. नाउ अब हम देखने वाले हैं कि ये ल्यूटिनाइजिंग हार्मोन और FSH हार्मोन कैसे ओव्यूलेशन को रेगुलेट करती हैं. सो ओव्यूलेशन में बेसिकली 3 फेजेस होते हैं. सो दैट्स योर फॉलिकुलर फेज, ओव्यूलेटरी फेज एंड योर ल्यूटियल फेज. सो फॉलिकुलर फेज जो होता है वो बेसिकली फ्रॉम डे 1 टू द डे 14 एग्जिस्ट करता है एंड ओव्यूलेटरी फेज जो है वो 14th या फिर 15th डे पर जो है होता है. नाउ अगर हम ल्यूटियल फेज की बात करें तो ल्यूटियल फेज जो है वो 16 to 28 डे ऑफ द साइकिल ये एग्जिस्ट करता है. नाउ दिस ब्लैक पोर्शन, अगर आप इस ब्लैक पोर्शन को देख पा रहे हैं तो ये ओवरी को जूम करके दिखाया गया है और यहाँ पर जो है वेरियस फॉलिकुलर स्टेजेस यहाँ पर दिखाए गए हैं जो कि कंटेन करते हैं oocyte को. नाउ व्हाट्स oocyte एंड व्हाट्स ओव्यूलेशन, लेट्स डाइव इनटू द टॉपिक. अगर हम ओव्यूलेशन की बात करें तो ओव्यूलेशन एक गैमेटोजेनेसिस का प्रोसेस है. नाउ व्हाट इज ओव्यूलेशन? ओव्यूलेशन के अंदर जो है हम एक डेप्लॉइड सेल लेते हैं और ये डेप्लॉइड सेल जो है वो स्पेशलाइज्ड स्टेम सेल है या फिर प्राइमोर्डियल सेल है जो कि एक सीरीज ऑफ चेंजेस से गुजरता है और अल्टीमेटली हम जो है हैप्लॉइड गैमेट प्रोड्यूस करते हैं इनसाइड द ओवरी. व्हाट इज़ द ओवरी? ओवरी इज़ एक्चुअली योर प्राइमरी सेक्स ऑर्गन एंड प्राइमरी सेक्स ऑर्गन को जो है हम गोनैड्स भी कहते हैं. Now if we talk about the ovulation, so at the time of birth there is present a cell which is called the oogonium. So oogonium cell is present and it is diploid in condition. what does this mean? Diploid condition. Diploid condition का मतलब है कि यहाँ पर दो sets of chromosome है, one is from maternal and one is from paternal. So this is diploid condition. Now this oogonium cell undergoes differentiation and differentiates in the form of meiosis. So it undergoes meiosis and converts down into the primordial follicle. Now, can you see this primordial follicle consisting of this oocyte? Now, this primordial follicle under positive induction of the FSH. So FSH gives the positive signal and it gets converted down into your primary follicle. Now, one thing I want you to make understand is that ये जो ओगोनियम जो चेंज हुआ प्राइमोर्डियल फॉलिकल में, ये एक्चुअली प्री प्यूबर्टी के दौरान हुआ है. एंड जब प्यूबर्टी हिट होती है तो ये प्राइमोर्डियल फॉलिकल जो है 1 डिग्री फॉलिकल में कन्वर्ट हो जाता है. हाउ विल यू डिफाइन दिस 1 डिग्री फॉलिकल? सो बेसिकली यहाँ पर आप सेल्स देख पा रहे हैं. दीज आर योर फॉलिकुलर सेल्स. So the follicular cells are actually enclosing the oocyte and this oocyte is primary oocyte. Now again we go to the oogonium. So ये जो है meiosis में गया और meiosis में जाने के बाद जो है primordial follicle जो है वो प्रोफेज 1 ऑफ द meiosis 1 में अरेस्ट हो जाता है और यही जो है आगे कंटिन्यू करता है. Now again this 1 degree follicle is consisting the primary oocyte and again this primary oocyte is arrested in the prophase 1 of the meiosis 1. Now what happens is that this primary follicle is converted down to the secondary follicle, but this is the early secondary follicle. Now what happens is that FSH creates positive signals and induces these follicular cells to get proliferate. ये proliferate करते हैं और यहाँ पर आपको दिख रहा है कि यहाँ पे thousands of cells हैं. So ये cells को हम कहते हैं granulosa cells and this green portion is known as your zona pellucida layer and it is also created from this follicular cell. Now can you see these red kind of cells? These cells are actually theca cells. Now the theca cells are enclosing the granulosa cells and granulosa cells is enclosing the zona pellucida layer and again it is enclosing the primary oocyte which is arrested in the prophase 1 of the meiosis 1. Now what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna zoom it down. I'm gonna zoom this portion, the theca cells. So this is the theca cell and I'm gonna draw the granulosa cell with this, and what happens is that LH, which is luteinizing hormone, it comes and binds to the receptor and what happens is that the cholesterol जो कि आपका थिका सेल्स के अंदर है वो कन्वर्ट हो जाता है एंड्रोजेंस में एंड यही एंड्रोजेंस जो है आगे जाकर एस्ट्रोजन में कन्वर्ट हो जाता है जो कि ग्रैनुलोसा सेल्स के अंदर होता है एंड इसके लिए जो पॉजिटिव सिग्नल इंड्यूस करता है वो होता है FSH. सो FSH क्रिएट्स द पॉजिटिव सिग्नल. ऑलराइट, नाउ सो LH का भी यहाँ पर थोड़ा सा फंक्शन है एंड व्हाट हैपन्स इज दैट दिस 1 degree follicle is converted down to the 2 degree follicle which is early 2 degree follicle and also producing estrogen. Alright, now what happens is that this early secondary follicle is converted down to the late secondary follicle. Now you can see that the thicker cells, they got differentiated into theca externa and the theca interna. Now what happens is that these zona pellucida layer are still consisting the primary oocyte that is arrested in your prophase 1 of meiosis 1. Now what happens is that due to the LH, what it does, it gives positive signals to the granulosa cells now to convert down into your follicular fluid. They start producing follicular fluid, which is rich in your hyaluronic acid. Now, they create the follicular fluid like this, and the pockets of the follicular fluid are induced by the FSH. Now, in the next phase, what happens is that this late secondary follicle is converted down to your, yes please, this is Graafian follicle. This Graafian follicle is also known as your tertiary follicle or your vesicular follicle. Now, can you see these theca layers and this oocyte? Now, this is not the primary oocyte. Now, this primary oocyte is get converted down into the secondary oocyte. So, this is the secondary oocyte. Now, what happens is that meiosis 2 happens. Meiosis 2 occurs. Alright, now this secondary oocyte is arrested at the metaphase 2 stage of the meiosis 2. Now, can you see this zona pellucida layer? The outer portion of this zona pellucida layer, the granulosa cells, are converted down into another special type of cells, and that's your corona radiata. सो ये लेयर्स जो है वो कोरोना रेडिएटा में कन्वर्ट हो जाती हैं। एंड क्या आपको ये पोर्शन दिख रहा है? ये पोर्शन जो है वो बिग बिग कैविटी है, एंड दिस कैविटी इज नोन एज योर एंट्रम. सो व्हाट हैपेंस इज दैट during conversion of this late secondary follicle into your Graafian follicle, this follicular fluid, they fuse together and they give rise to a big cavity which is known as your antrum. This is your antrum. Now, this primordial follicle gets converted down into your 1 degree follicle, which is primary follicle, and this happens at the puberty, right? And this happens because of some androgens, right? So what happens is that from the primordial follicle to the Graafian follicle, all these stages are known as your follicular stages, right? This is the follicular phase. So can you see is that the FSH and your LH is producing estrogen here, also estrogen here. सो FSH जो है वो मेजरली एस्ट्रोजन को प्रोड्यूस कर रहा है, एंड थोड़ा सा जो है वो LH जो है वो एस्ट्रोजन को प्रोड्यूस करने में हेल्प कर रहा है. सो ओवरऑल फॉलिकुलर फेज में हो क्या रहा है? एस्ट्रोजन की प्रोडक्शन हो रही है. नाउ one thing is very important is that this follicular phase is happening between the day 1 to the day 14, and we are concerned with the topic is that estrogen levels are very high. Now at the midpoint, the day 7, 8 or 9, the estrogen levels are very high. Estrogen levels are very high, and what they're gonna do is that they create a pathway, and they're gonna act on hypothalamus, and they're gonna act on the anterior pituitary in a negative way. This says that stop producing gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, at the day 14 or the late follicular phase, estrogen levels are again high, and these high levels of estrogen again acts on the, yes please, the anterior pituitary and your hypothalamus, and this time they gives positive signals. All right, they say that create FSH and LH, and simultaneously what happens is that the Graafian follicle, they release a hormone which is known as your inhibin, particularly the inhibin B. So this inhibin B, what it does, it acts on the anterior pituitary and says that stop producing the FSH. So he says that stop producing the FSH. So simultaneously there is lot of LH is produced, and this LH which is produced is known as your LH surge. Now we are going to the 14th or 15th day, which is actually the ovulatory phase. What happens is there we are having lot of LH. So LH is acting here. LH is acting on the Graafian follicle and giving positive signals. So what happens is that these, suppose this is your Graafian follicle, and we are having arteries, and these arteries are getting more permeable. So what happens is that the blood is rushing inside the Graafian follicle and filling this antrum and saying that the Graafian follicle needs to be more big. Now, what happens is that simultaneously the scissor enzymes acts. So, scissor enzymes acts on the Graafian follicle. What they do is that they cut at specific position of the Graafian follicle, and suppose this was your Graafian follicle and this was your secondary oocyte, so they cut them a specific position so that oocyte is popping out of that Graafian follicle. Now this secondary oocyte is composed of the zona pellucida layer and the corona radiata, so this is popping out of it. So suppose this is your secondary oocyte. Now what happens is that this, can you see this portion? This is your fimbriae, which is scraping over this ovary. So what happens is that he catches this oocyte inside this ampulla region. Now this portion, you can see this is the ampullary isthmus junction, and the fimbriae is having various columnar cells with the cilia. So they have columnar cells with the cilia, which helps this oocyte to travel down to the ampullar region, and at the ampullary region what happens, sperm comes and fertilizes with this oocyte. So this is the ovulatory phase, which is happening at the 14th or the 15th day. Now what happens is that now luteal phase comes into play. Now this happens from day 16th to the day 28th. Now in the luteal phase what happens is that rest of the structure which is left is actually filled with the blood. Now this structure is actually called the hemorrhagium or the hemorrhagic corpus luteum. You can call it as HCl. Now what happens is that this HCl is induced with the LH. Now again this HCl is induced with the LH, luteinizing hormone. Again, this HCl is known as your hemorrhagic corpus luteum or the hemorrhagicum corpus. Now, this corpus hemorrhagicum is actually filled with lot of blood. Now, this is the remnant portion of the Graafian follicle after the ovulation. Now, what happens is that this gonna burst out. Now, this bursts out and creates the hemoperitoneum. So, hemoperitoneum is a result of bursting out the, yes please, the hemorrhagic corpus luteum. Now, simultaneously, some of the granulosa cells of the Graafian follicle, they differentiate and they modify themselves into the specialized cells, and these cells are converted down into secretory cells, and these cells are actually accumulating lipids, cholesterol, fats inside them, and they are actually yellow in color. So these secretory cells are actually known as your corpus luteum. Now, this corpus luteum is again induced with the LH and produces a hormone which is known as your PG, and this PG is progesterone. Now, this progesterone is very, very important in the menstrual cycle. Now, we are moving ahead to our menstrual cycle, and menstrual cycle is also known as your female reproductive cycle. Now, before moving on to the menstrual cycle, we should understand the layers of the uterine, right? This is the uterine cavity and this is the uterus. So this green portion is known as your myometrium, and this blue portion and this white portion with the coiled arteries, they both combine they form the endometrium. Now, this white portion is actually known as your stratum functionalis, and this blue portion is known as your stratum basalis. Now, outer portion of this myometrium is your perimetrium. Now we are moving and diving towards the topic menstrual cycle or the female reproductive cycle. Now, we should understand that how many phases are there in the menstrual cycle. So there is menstruation phase, and then there is proliferative phase, and then there is the secretory phase. So this menstruation phase is basically from day 1 to day 5 it exists, and after that from the day 6 to the day 14 the proliferative phase exists. Now from the day 15 to the day 28 or 29 the secretory phase exists. So this is the secretory phase. Now what happens is that during the menstruation phase, from the day 1 to the day 5, bleeding occurs. What is the bleeding? Actually this stratum functionalis layer, and with this coiled artery, can you see these coiled arteries? They actually shed off, and they shed off, they passes through this is the cervix region and this is the vaginal region. So they pass out from the vagina and they ultimately lead to the bleeding. This is basically the menstruation phase. So now we have completed the menstruation phase. We are moving to the proliferative phase, which is happening between the 6 to the 14 days. Now in the proliferative phase, can you see this is happening between the 6th day to the 14th day, and we are very much aware that from day 1 to the day 14 in the ovulation phase there is a follicular phase, and the follicular phase is happening between the day 1 to the day 14, and day 1 से लेकर day 14 तक जो है एस्ट्रोजन के लेवल्स जो हैं बहुत ही हाई होते हैं. तो एस्ट्रोजन क्या करता है बेसिकली, एस्ट्रोजन जो है वो ब्लड स्ट्रीम में मौजूद होता है, एंड ये जो एस्ट्रोजन्स जो प्रोड्यूस हुए हैं ये एक्चुअली ब्लड स्ट्रीम में होते हैं, so they fall down to the blood stream basically and makes estrogen levels high during the first day to the 14th day, that is your follicular period. Now we are concerning with the proliferative phase, which is from the 6th day to the 14th day, and estrogen levels are high from the 6th day to the 14th day. What they're going to do is that they're going to regenerate this stratum functionalis layer again. They're going to regenerate this stratum functionalis layer again, and they're going to regenerate these coiled arteries again. So coiled arteries का again formation हो जाना, इस process को हम कहते हैं angiogenesis. Now एस्ट्रोजन का दूसरा काम ये है कि स्ट्रैटम फंक्शनैलिस लेयर को तो रीजनरेट कर दिया, उसके साथ साथ जो है यहाँ पर यूट्रिन ग्लैंड्स भी जो है फॉर्म हो जाती हैं. सो यहाँ पर यूट्रिन ग्लैंड्स की जो है फॉर्मेशन हो जाती है कुछ इस तरीके से. सो दीज आर योर यूट्रिन ग्लैंड्स. And also what it does, the estrogen makes positive signals and induces the cervical region to produce thin mucus. सर्विक्स में जो है कॉलमनार या क्यूबॉइडल सेल्स जो है वो मौजूद होती हैं, और यहाँ से जो है वो थिन म्यूकस और कुछ केमिकल्स रिलीज होते हैं ताकि जो स्पर्म जो एंटर कर रहा है उसको जो है कैपेसिटेट कर पाए. नाउ व्हाट इज कैपेसिटेशन? कैपेसिटेशन इज एक्चुअली क्लीनिंग द हेड ऑफ द स्पर्म बेसिकली. नाउ व्हाई द कैपेसिटेशन इज इम्पॉर्टेंट? कैपेसिटेशन इसलिए इम्पॉर्टेंट है ताकि जब भी ये स्पर्म जो है ट्रैवल कर कर एम्पुलरी इस्थमस जंक्शन में जाएगा तो उससे पहले हम इसको रेडी कर दें कि ये फ्यूज़ कर सके oocyte के साथ. Now this is the basic of capacitation, and this is actually done by the chemicals released from the cervix, and this is induced by the positive signals of the estrogen levels. Now this all is happening in the proliferative phase. Now again I'm repeating, in the proliferative phase what happens is that the regeneration of the stratum functionalis layer and the angiogenesis, and the next is that the production of the, yes please, the uterine glands, and the next is your producing thin mucus to provide a smooth entry of the sperm, and some chemicals are released also for the capacitation of the sperm. Now remember, at day 14 the proliferative phase is ending. So हमें पता है कि 14th या फिर 15th डे पर जो है ओव्यूलेटरी फेज़ होता है, और ओव्यूलेटरी फेज़ के दौरान जो है LH सर्ज की वजह से जो है ओव्यूलेशन होता है, और ओव्यूलेशन के साथ साथ होने के साथ यहाँ पर अगर बाई चांस जो है कॉपुलेशन हुआ तो स्पर्म जो है एंटर कर कर फ्यूज़ कर जाएगा, और 14th डे पर अगर फर्टिलाइजेशन हुआ तो होगा क्या, यहाँ पर ये जो है सीरीज़ ऑफ चेंजेस में कन्वर्ट होगा. सो फर्टिलाइज्ड जो जाइगोट है वो सीरीज़ ऑफ चेंजेस में जाएगा, और अल्टीमेटली यहाँ पे ब्लास्टोसिस्ट जो है वो यूट्रिन कैविटी यानी कि यहाँ पर एंडोमेट्रियम पर जो है इम्प्लांट हो जाएगा, और इसे हम इम्प्लांटेशन कहते हैं. नाउ आफ्टर द प्रोलिफरेटरी फेज the secretory phase comes, and this secretory phase is existing between the 15th day to the 28th or the 29th day. Now what happens is that during the secretory phase the primary hormone is your progesterone. Now can you remember that the progesterone which is released from the corpus luteum is actually down into your bloodstream? So what happens is that the progesterone is acting on the stratum functionalis and making it more thicker. सो प्रोजेस्टेरॉन की वजह से जो है सिक्रेटरी फेज में जो है स्ट्रैटम फंक्शनैलिस मोर थिकर हो जाएगा, साथ ही साथ एंजियोजेनेसिस भी होगी मोर. सो एंजियोजेनेसिस के बाद क्या होगा, यूट्रिन ग्लैंड से जो है सिक्रेशंस निकलेगी एंड ये सिक्रेशंस जो है हाई होगी किसमें, ग्लाइकोजन में, एंड देन दे विल बी रिच इन लिपिड्स एंड दे विल बी रिच इन proteins. Now suppose कर रहे हैं कि there is no implantation happen, so what happens is that progesterone they act on the cervix and they produce thick mucus, and thick mucus की production की वजह से यहाँ पर जो है एक plug create हो जाएगा एंड इस प्लग को हम सर्वाइकल प्लग कहते हैं. नाउ दिस सर्वाइकल प्लग इज़ वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट टू प्रोटेक्ट द एक्चुअल पोटेंशियल एम्ब्रियो that will be formed. Now we have two cases is that if there is fertilization is occurring or if there is fertilization not occurring. Now if the fertilization occurs, what happens at the day 14 fertilization occurs, it creates the blastocyst and blastocyst is implanted into the endometrium. Now the embryo releases a hormone. Now suppose this is your embryo and it releases a hormone called HCG. Now what's the HCG? HCG is actually the human chorionic hormone. What it's gonna do is that it will act on the corpus luteum. Now corpus luteum, what it does, it produces more progesterone. Now why this progesterone is important? This progesterone is important for the placenta development. So here the placenta develops till the 12th week until the progesterone is still producing due to the HCG. Now this is the case when fertilization occurs. Now what happens when no fertilization occurs? So if no fertilization occurs, there is no embryo, that means no HCG is produced, and that means no induction to the corpus luteum to produce this progesterone, which is important for the implantation process and for maintaining this endometrium to be valid for the potential embryo. Now what happens is that no induction is produced to the corpus luteum. What happens is that this corpus luteum ultimately gets converted down into your fibrous fatty tissue. Fibrous fatty tissue and looks like a scare. So looks like a scare, and this scare is actually nothing but the corpus albicans. So corpus albicans is actually a result of no fertilization. No fertilization means no embryo, no HCG production, no induction to the corpus luteum to produce more progesterone, and it ultimately leads to the corpus luteum to produce to gets converted down into your fibrous fatty tissue, which is actually a dead tissue. Now that's very important, it's a dead tissue actually. Now this dead tissue is appearing as a scare, and this is known as your corpus albicans. Now one thing I need to make you understand is that the progesterone is very very important for the vasodilation activity of these arteries which are coiled inside the stratum functionalis. Now if there is a fertilization, if there is a positive induction to produce the progesterone, so the progesterone will help these arteries, these coiled arteries, to sustain a valid vasodilation. Now if no progesterone is there, so suppose this is your coiled artery inside the stratum functionalis. What happens is that if there is no PG, no progesterone, so what happens is that spasm are created. What is spasm? स्पैज्म का मतलब ये है कि इन आर्टरीज में जो है साइमल्टेनियस वेजो कंस्ट्रिक्शन भी होगा, वेजो डायलेशन भी होगा, जिसकी वजह से ये वेसल्स बहुत ही ज़्यादा फ्रेजाइल बन जाती हैं और अल्टीमेटली बहुत ज़्यादा वेजो डायलेशन होने की वजह से ये बर्स्ट कर जाती हैं। नाउ बर्स्ट करने के बाद होगा क्या, यहाँ पर बहुत सारा ब्लड लॉस होगा। सो इस रीजन में, स्ट्रैटम फंक्शनैलिस रीजन में ब्लड जो है एक्यूमुलेट हो जाएगा। साथ ही साथ यहाँ पर जो आर्टरीज प्रेजेंट है, जो कि ब्लू पोर्शन, दैट इज द स्ट्रैटम बेसालिस, जहाँ से न्यूट्रिएंट्स का सप्लाई हो रहा है, ऑक्सीजन का सप्लाई हो रहा है, वो होना बंद हो जाएगा। इस कंडीशन को हम कहते हैं इस्केमिक कंडीशन। नाउ इस्केमिक कंडीशन में क्या होगा कि ये जो टिश्यू है, दैट्स योर स्ट्रैटम फंक्शनैलिस, this will become dead. And what happens is that in the late secretory phase, this become shedding off. So with the accumulated blood and stratum functionalis, so stratum functionalis layer plus the blood, what they're gonna do is that they shed out and create bleeding. What's that? It is basically again starting the menstrual cycle. So menstrual cycle 2 is again started, right? So this is all about the menstrual cycle or the female reproductive cycle, and we have justified that how is the progesterone is important for all the implantation and all the vasodilation of these coiled arteries. And one thing I need to make you understand is that when there is no implantation, progesterone is that hormone which is actually inducing this cervix to produce the thick mucus. And one thing I need to differentiate is that the estrogen is that hormone which is inducing this cervix to produce the thin mucus. So the thin mucus is for the entry of the sperm, and the thick mucus is for blocking all the foreign sperms or the foreign agents to protect the actual embryo.